In this video, we're going to be looking in detail at the different types of layers that you can use in PBR Painter. In one of the previous videos, I talked generally about the layering system in PBR Painter and how layers work. But in this video, I'm going to go into more detail about those specific types of layers. Before I begin, I'm going to swap this bottom panel across to the shader editor so that we can see down here what's happening as we add different layers. Okay, so I'm going to click Add a New Layer. By default, this is set to a standard layer and to a filled layer. So we're going to talk about this filled versus painted later on. For a start, we're going to talk about the different layer types. So in PBR Painter 3, at the time of making this video, there are three different layer types: standard, multipaint, and custom nodes. So the standard layer is what we've been looking at up until this point, and it is basically the type of layer that has most of the functionality that's intended to be accessed using the PBR Painter UI. So when you're working with a standard layer, everything is basically done from within here. So you don't need to go in and look at specific nodes because all of the nodes that are inside this group here are controlled using this interface. So when I turn on the color and I change this to procedural or whatever else, all of that is happening as a node setup in here, but you don't need to worry about that because you only need to access it from in here. And for a standard layer, there are a very specific number of types that you can set up for each channel, and then you can control different settings in here based on that type. So you can, for example, set up procedural. You can set up to add a texture, which basically lets you add a separate image texture into here. You can set up other options in here, and I'm going to explain these in a later video where I talk about these specific channel types in detail. But for now, you just need to understand that this standard layer is going to give you most of the functionality of PBR Painter in terms of working with this panel in here. The second layer type I'm going to talk about is the custom nodes. So I'm going to leave the multi-paint one till last. So I'm going to add a layer like this, and you'll notice that this appears as a different color. And this is so that you can differentiate the two different types. You'll also notice that we have a little icon in here that differentiates them as well. So the standard layers look like this, and this is the custom nodes layer like this. So as for a standard layer, we need to turn on the layers that we want to work with, like this. But unlike a standard layer, you can't actually change anything in here on these custom nodes layers. Instead, you'll be told that you need to add nodes within the shader editor. So we need to select the green node group, which is this one that we're working with. And then we can press Tab, and that's going to open up the node group that is basically going to let us build whatever it is that we want, and it's going to then use that as a layer. So what you'll see is, now that we've turned on the base color, we have a setup that looks like this. So down the bottom here, this is the input. So this is everything that's coming in from previous layers into this node group. And that's going to run straight through into this node group here, into this layer in base color. And basically what that's doing is it's bringing in all those previous channels as inputs into this group here. This is basically going to contain all of the masks that we create in here. So even though it's a custom nodes layer, we can still use the PBR Painter masking system, and all of that masking is going to happen inside this node group. So what you can then do is you can then create any type of custom node setup that you want, and then you can feed that into this base color or whatever other channel you're using, and it will apply that masking and then spit out the final result of all of those different mixed layers, which are then going to go to the output of this node group and then outputting as per the normal standard layers like this. So for example, we can add maybe a noise texture like that. And what you can see is now that's now using that for this specific layer. If we turn on metallic, you can see that we now have access to that metallic, and we can either adjust this or we can set up additional nodes in here to feed into that metallic. And as I said, the good thing about this is we can still use this masking system. So for example, we can add maybe a gradient mask. And what you can see is that we're now adding this custom material as a layer and only applying it to this one half of our model based on this gradient mask. So the reason this custom nodes layer type is here is because it allows you to basically break out of the constraints of the standard layer and the other layers that we've got and build whatever you want into this as a single layer based on your custom node setup, while also taking advantage of this masking system. Note that you can also, if you want, you can also use these inputs from these previous layers and build in your own masks or whatever it is that you want into here as well. So you're not constrained to only using these masks, but you can use these if you would like to. What I'm going to do now is move on to the last type of layer. And I'm only going to talk about this very briefly because we haven't really covered all of the concepts necessary to fully understand this layer, but there will be a specific video just covering this final layer type. So the last type we're going to talk about is a multi-paint layer, and I'm going to add that layer, but I'm not going to actually use it in this video because it's a little bit too advanced, and I will leave that for the other video. Basically, what a multi-paint layer does is it lets you project onto your material multiple layers at a time. So for example, you could have a brick PBR material and you have the base color, the metallic, the roughness, whatever other channels that are in that PBR material. And this multi-paint layer lets you freely paint that and project it onto your model wherever you want, however you want. So this is something that's brand new in PBR Painter 3, and it's going to let you do all sorts of cool things like paint on complex decals with multiple channels simultaneously, and also do things like covering up seams in your material. Again, it's a little bit too advanced to actually show it, but I do want to point out that that's there, and I definitely encourage you when you're ready for it to watch that later video and understand exactly what that's doing. And again, we have a different icon in here, and this is basically indicating that this is a multi-paint layer. And the same kind of rules apply in terms of turning on channels, adding masks, and all of that as for all the other layers. So for now, I'm going to get rid of that one and leave that for the later video. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about in this video is I'm going to address when you're using a standard or a custom nodes layer, you have this option to do a filled or painted layer. So far, we've only been using filled layers, which is just by default, just filling the entire material with that layer. But you can also select painted, and that's going to basically build in a mask that's going to allow you to do painting. So what you need to do when you select painted is you need to specify the resolution of that mask, and then you can select whether or not to use a 32-bit float as well. So I'm just going to leave that like that and click OK. Now what that's actually done is it's created a layer in exactly the same way as previously, but it has added an extra mask in here, and this is a painted mask. And essentially what this is doing is it's adding an image texture mask that is automatically set up for painting, and it's locking that mask at the top of your layer stack. So that straight away when you do that, it will also turn on the base color, and you can kind of start painting directly onto that material. The reason that this is useful is because then you can just add your other settings like this, turn on your different channels, whatever it is that you want, and you can just paint directly onto that. You can obviously also add additional masks in there and customize that masking as well. And then you can change your color of your brush, basically, or you can change the color in here, and you can paint on different colors while also adjusting these other channels as well. Now, I will point out that technically with a filled layer, you can actually set up a mask in the same way. You can turn on painting, you can set up all these channels in the same way, and you can achieve the same thing as a painted layer, but it's there to make it easier and quicker so that you're automatically set up to do this kind of painting of your materials like that. And we can do things like bump the material out if we want to. And you can also use various other layer settings to achieve different effects. Okay, so I've talked about the different layer types, given a brief overview. As I've said, there's a lot of stuff going on that I haven't yet talked about, and it's going to be covered slowly in future videos. So if you're feeling like you don't understand parts of this, hopefully by the end of this fundamental series, you'll have a good understanding of what's going on. And I also encourage you to experiment and explore and just try and understand through experience what's happening, because that can be one of the best ways to learn these things. In the next video, we're going to be covering this painting in more detail. So we showed briefly how you can use a painted layer, and this kind of sets up a mask to do painting, but there's lots of different ways that you can do this painting on images in PBR Painter. And in that video, we're also going to go through the settings you can set up in here, and how you can control your brush to paint on different effects. So anyway, that's it for this video, and I will catch you in that next one. Cheers!